En primer término, decirles que si alguno o alguna de ustedes necesita traducción, ahí tenemos disponible la traducción, pueden solicitar los audífonos. La conferencia se va a realizar en inglés, entonces si hay alguna, lo indica y por favor. Lo segundo es que, bueno, darles la bienvenida a nombre del Colegio de la Frontera Norte y en este caso también en representación del doctor Donatio Guillén López, quien estaría en esta mesa, pero un asunto imponderable le impidió estar presente. Pero quisiera señalarles que esta conferencia se inscribe en un marco general estratégico para el Colegio de la Frontera Norte y que tiene que ver con el acercamiento, el estudio, la investigación, el diálogo con las y los mexicanos, chicanos que viven en Estados Unidos, entender mejor lo que significa esa población, no solo desde el peso económico, que a veces es lo que más se destaca, sino esa enorme dimensión cultural que significa lo que en algún momento el gran antropólogo chicano Américo Paredes definió como el Gran México, ese México de afuera que nunca lo ha estado en realidad, pero que no hemos tenido la suficiente voluntad ni comprensión de lo que ocurría al norte del río Bravo con las y los mexicanos que fueron cruzados por la frontera a partir de la firma de los tratados de Guadalupe Hidalgo el 2 de febrero de 1848. El Colegio de la Frontera Norte entonces impulsa un proyecto amplio sobre este México de afuera que incluye varias actividades sobre las cuales les comentará el doctor David Maciel, quien es la persona responsable de este proyecto, de impulsarlo, de darle sentido. Y en todo caso, lo que quiero es darles la bienvenida y sobre todo una muy especial recepción al doctor Richard Griswold del Castillo, un gran amigo, un académico a quien reconozco no solo por sus enormes aportaciones para la comprensión de la vida, la familia, la cultura chicana, sino también como un hombre generoso. Quienes hemos tenido la oportunidad de conocerlo podemos constatar esta condición humana que ha caracterizado al doctor Richard Griswold del Castillo, y yo simplemente quiero decirle que estoy muy contento, muy orgulloso de que nos haya visitado a través de, en este caso, de la mediación del doctor David Maciel. Entonces, por mi parte, además de darle la bienvenida, además de reconocer la relevancia de este proyecto, pasaría a darle la palabra al doctor David Maciel, coordinador de esta serie de conferencias de las voces del México de afuera, y entonces le pediría que él se hiciera, digamos, cargo del seguimiento, de la coordinación de esta reunión.
Pues bienvenidos todos, les agradezco muchísimo su presencia, le agradezco mucho las palabras al doctor Valenzuela, que él es un pionero en este esfuerzo, para él no es nada nuevo, él ha abordado los dos Méxicos en su propia investigación, en sus propios esfuerzos, ha sido pionero en la Academia Mexicana de estos enlaces y tratar de también señalar los aportes y la importancia de los mexicanos en Estados Unidos. Este es un esfuerzo, como decía el doctor Valenzuela, que queremos constantemente hacer los puentes entre los académicos, activistas, políticos de origen mexicano principalmente y latinos en Estados Unidos y el COLEF, y más allá del COLEF y de la frontera al resto de México, que todavía nos falta mucho que hacer en este esfuerzo. Yo creo que ha habido en el pasado un gran desencuentro entre lo que yo llamaría, y también el doctor Valenzuela lo ha mencionado en mucha de su obra, de los dos Méxicos, o el Gran México, si lo vemos de la perspectiva como él lo planteaba, de don Américo Paredes, que lo planteó, y otros pioneros chicanos, mexicano-americanos que han visto esta necesidad, y también unos pioneros, hay que darle crédito a algunos pioneros mexicanos como Manuel Gamio, como Miguel León Portilla en su momento, como algunos aislados que sí se han interesado mucho. Y continuando con estos esfuerzos, se nos ocurrió que sería muy enriquecedor tener una serie de conferencistas de ambas, no de ambas, sino de un extenso gama de las vidas políticas, culturales, académicas, sociales, y traerlas aquí al COLEF para compartir con ustedes su experiencia, su obra, sus perspectivas, darnos sugerencias de cómo mejorar este esfuerzo y también conocer lo enriquecedor que es la obra de tales personas como el doctor Richard Griswold. Y hablando de él, para mí es un increíble placer y un gran honor darle formalmente la bienvenida y su participación a este ciclo de conferencias. No creo que pudiéramos tener un académico tan aclamado en muchas formas, tan creativo, tan dedicado a esta investigación como el doctor Richard Griswold del Castillo. Lo que lo separa a él de muchos otros académicos es la temática tan voluminosa y creativa de su obra. Él tiene monografías, libros extensos sobre historia de la familia, sobre el libro del Tratado de Guadalupe Hidalgo. Ahorita los voy a circular un poco para que conozcan nomás parte de su gran repertorio de investigación. Tiene una cobiografía de César Chávez, tiene un libro de síntesis de la historia de los mexicanos chicanos en Estados Unidos, tiene un libro que me pareció a mí interesantísimo porque creo que humildemente muchos de nosotros estamos, aunque si no presentes por nombre, de todos modos presentes en espíritu, que se titula Chicano San Diego, que es las aportaciones y la historia de la comunidad chicana desde sus orígenes hasta el presente. Otra idea del doctor Richard Griswold del Castillo, y estos nomás son unos pequeños menciones de su obra. Acaba de terminar un libro coeditado con un colega sobre la participación de los chicanos en la Segunda Guerra Mundial, otro libro como tantos de él, pionero en su momento, y la calidad se destaca igual que la riquísima temática de su creatividad, como les menciono. Entonces es un gran honor para mí presentarles y dejarles al doctor Richard Griswold, quien nos hablará en unas breves palabras de su obra, y como no tenemos mucho tiempo, pues lo va a hacer breve y luego la vamos a hacer bilingüe. Él va a hacer su exposición en inglés, pero las preguntas las pueden hacer con toda confianza en español. Aquí tenemos a dos que haremos lo que podamos para traducir y un poco darle seguimiento a esto. Entonces, sin más, le doy la palabra al doctor Griswold del Castillo.
Gracias, David. Y gracias, doctor Valenzuela, y gracias a COLEF y presidente Guillén, y a ustedes para estar aquí en vez de la playa. Es muy bonito hoy. Voy a dar mi ponencia en estilo pocho, un poco pocho, inglés, español a veces. David asked me to, I'm very flattered that, and a little bit embarrassed, that I am going to be talking mostly about my own personal life in relationship to the history and other work that I've done. But actually, that's an idea I had some time ago. I started to think, well, wouldn't it be interesting to see what relationship, if any, was between my personal life and my public life in terms of what I was doing academically and otherwise. And of course, there is always a relationship. It's probably deep and Freudian and so forth, but I won't get into that in talking about this. But David would like me to talk about why these books came in, these major books that I got involved with. I'll talk about that, but I also want to talk about some of the inspirations that I had from individuals So I call this my personal and public journey, so we'll see how successful it is. And here you have a picture of me at age 2, or no, maybe a little less, and then maybe a few years ago. I was born in 1942 in Los Angeles. My mother was a Mexican immigrant. She came with her parents. She crossed the border in Tijuana in 1922, and my grandparents here are pictured on the right, Julio and Berta del Castillo. My grandmother was from Piedras Negras in Coahuila, and I guess somehow her family found their way down to Mexico City. My grandfather's family were merchants, commercial people in Mexico City, and they married there and so forth. And then during the revolution, the last part of the revolution, for political reasons, I think, but also because he wanted to get away from his father, who was kind of controlling, they decided to come to the United States. He spoke some English. He learned English actually he was sent to school in the United States by his father for a while. My grandmother knew no English at all. Anyway, they came to Los Angeles. They settled in central Los Angeles, and my mother went to public school. My father was from Minnesota, and his family came to Los Angeles in the 20s also to get away from allergies. He had a severe problem with allergies. And so Stanley was his name. Stanley Griswold. He's pictured in the bottom photo with my brothers and me and one of my cousins and his wife, Edith. And so they were typical Midwestern types, very Protestant, very sort of middle class. And he was a real estate guy. He bought real estate, or he fixed up real estate. So my father was going to Manual Arts High School in East LA, or actually Central LA, and so was my mother, and that's where they met. And there's a whole story we have about their meeting and how she had to sneak around and so forth, because his parents did not want her to marry anybody who did not wear a tie, una corbata, right? It had to be muy gente very respectable. So they did get married eventually, and in 1941 he was in the Navy because of World War II, excuse me, and so that was it. So I grew up in Los Angeles, a little bit in Corpus Christi because he was stationed there for a while, and then I came back. They came back to Los Angeles for a while, and then we moved to Orange County, to Santana. And I went to high school in Santana. And well, needless to say, we didn't speak Spanish in the house. My father, couldn't speak much Spanish. And so my mother was of that generation, the Mexican-American generation, who wanted to assimilate as much as possible to become an American, right? And so she stuck with English. Later in her life, after they split up, my mother remarried, and she eventually ended up really getting in touch with Mexicanos in the United States. She became part of a community of Mexicanos in her church, and but anyway, my mother and father didn't speak Spanish to us, so the Spanish I learned, what little Spanish I did learn, was from my grandparents, and so that was our life. Now, I suppose I was emotionally closest to my grandparents, the Del Castillos. We'd go over there a lot. And this has some influence on the first project that I did on the Los Angeles Barrio, which was where they were from, basically. It was their story, or rather, part of their story, the Los Angeles Barrio. So over the years in writing and doing history, I was influenced by my mother, my father, certainly his work ethic. He was a Puritan Protestant ethic type person, you know, had to work all the time, no lying around. And my mother, who had a great sense of humor, and told me when I think I realized that I was not 100% Anglo at some point. And I asked her about it. I said, well, you know, what am I? And she said, well, you've got the best of both cultures. You're the best of Mexican culture and the best of American culture. So I let it go. The Chicano movement was a long way away. And in any case, I decided to go to college, or I was able to go to college. I was very lucky to go to Berkeley for 2 years. And then this is before the Vietnam War, 1960-62. Then I decided that I guess that maybe some of my interest in Chicano history later comes from a kind of feeling of alienation from the Anglo-American middle-class environment. And this really started at Berkeley, I think. I started to feel pretty critical of the things that were going on in the United States and around me in the early 60s. And for that reason, I decided to go on my own to university in France. So I signed up on my own. I wasn't on a foreign exchange thing or junior year abroad thing, to just go to the University of Dijon in France for a year. So I bought my ticket and I went. And they had a special program for foreigners. And I went through for a year and found out I really wasn't French. So I decided to come back, and I was sort of turned off of everything. And I ended up working for the San Clemente Sewer District and living with my father. And I suppose that's part of presaged my future as well. My job was to go into the sewage area where they were drying and to shovel it into trucks, and they would haul it away for the golf course. So at one point I was digging a ditch for the sewer district, and I was at the bottom of the ditch, and I looked up and I said, there has to be an easier way to make a living. I think I'll go back to school. So I was lucky enough to get into UCLA. I don't think I could ever get into UCLA today, given there's tremendous competition. So I applied and was able to get into UCLA and to complete my bachelor's degree and so forth. So this is when the Chicano movement was just getting started, 65, 66. I was influenced at UCLA by a number of people who were my teachers and friends. Juan Gomez Quiñones, the first name on this list here, was a young professor in the history department at UCLA who had written his dissertation on Flores Magón, Ricardo Flores Magón. And he had published a book called Sembradores, which was kind of an intellectual history of the Magonistas in Los Angeles, and the Generación, their paper, which had been very progressive. So Juan was given the permission to teach, I think, the first Chicano history class at UCLA. It was a seminar, and it was very exciting because nobody knew anything about this. This was all new territory, although the books we used had to be ones that really you know, were kind of dated a little bit. But we did use his book. But Juan himself instilled in us a feeling that we were pioneros, right? We were on the cutting edge. We were going to be able to do research on topics that nobody else knew anything about. And so that was part of my formation, because eventually when I was able to enter the PhD program, that was first of all, I was majoring in U.S. history, American history. And at that time, it was incredibly boring, U.S. history. You take it in high school, you take it in middle school, you take it again in college. And I couldn't see getting too excited about United States history. But within United States history was the Chicano experience. So I decided to emphasize Chicano history. Of course, it didn't exist as a topic within the history bureaucracy at UCLA. But my dissertation focused on a Chicano topic, which was the history of the Mexicans in Los Angeles after the U.S.-Mexican War, 1850, 1890, I think it is. And so that was my dissertation. And that's, I guess, eventually it became a book, which was really fortunate because I was lucky enough to have James Wilkie, who is a historiador de Mexico. He's written a lot of books on the Mexican intelligentsia, and he took me under his wing, and he said, well, this is a pretty good dissertation. You have to rewrite it, of course, right? But I'll support you in the University of California Press to get it published. And this, I didn't realize it, but that was a big deal, because the University of California Press is not, nowadays, of course, nothing of mine would be published by them because it's very, very competitive, very hard to get published by them. So I was fortunate, so he guided me in getting my dissertation eventually published. Actually, I should mention somebody else who was important and as an influence on that book, the Los Angeles Barrio, and that would be a friend of mine who was an editor who I worked with very closely. Milt Savage was his name. And he lived up in the mountains. And I'd go up there twice a week, drive up there from San Diego up into the mountains to go over word by word everything in the dissertation. And we would talk about it and change it. And it was a real education to me of the craft of writing. So I was very fortunate. Milt Savage, I owed him a lot. He has passed away since then. So eventually the book did get published, and it was pretty interesting, I thought, to see how, at the same time, some of my colegas in UCLA were publishing their dissertations, like Ricardo Romo. He was in my seminar class. Now he's president of University of Texas, San Antonio. But his dissertation were about the Mexicans in Los Angeles in the 1910, 1920s. So he was covering a different era. But, and then Alberto Camarillo was also a colleague, and he published a book about the same time as mine about the Mexicanos in California. So we were beginning to have Chicano history created by young people who had gone through the universities, and we're looking for jobs, basically. I was looking for a job. In fact, I got fired from my first job while I got a letter from the publisher saying, congratulations, we're going to publish your book, and I got a letter from the university saying, you're fired. So that's when I came to San Diego State. That's another story, but anyway. Part of the motivation for writing, by the way, for me at least, has been fear. Because when you get in academia, you publish and you do perish if you don't publish. You have to publish. So I learned very quickly that that was how, if I wanted to be an academic, if I wanted to be a professor, if I wanted to continue doing research on Chicano history, I had to publish. And so, in fact, Manuel Servín, who maybe some of you might remember, is an old school Chicano historian, actually Mexican-American historian, took me aside while I was trying to find a job, and he said, the only security you can have in academia is to publish. Teaching, it matters, but it's not that important. So, so anyway, that's part of why what drove me to publish the next couple, or to try to write and get published several other books that I had. After that, I think it was more, well, influence of people, certainly, but I think the need to contribute something new, that to me was really exciting, that this was unknown territory. Nobody had written about it before. So I was doing something new, I was creating something new, and that was important to me. Then when I have to rehash the War of 1812 or Andrew Jackson's War on the Bank and things like this that were US history topics that had been rehashed many, many times. Well, I've been influenced at various times by different people, and I've listed them on the on this slide here. David, my friend and colleague over here, has been important to me because out of all the Chicano historians, he's the one who has been the most important in developing a belief that Chicano history is important in Mexico para Mexicanos, and the Chicanos should make an effort to learn about the Mexicanos and to teach about Chicano history in Mexico. So thanks to David, I applied for a Fulbright. Well, he got motivated to apply for a Fulbright scholarship, which was in Mexico City at the UNAM, and it was a wonderful experience. My wife and I traded houses with a professor at the UNAM. We traded cars with the UNAM, and so I got a chance to be a Chilango for about 6 months. That was fun. And I did a lot of research because actually there wasn't much teaching that they needed. I did teach a small seminar at Universidad de Monterrey for about 2 weeks. But anyway, David has been important in influencing me that way in terms of keeping in touch with a Mexicano connection, inspiring me to have some confidence in what I have been doing. Arnoldo de Leon, the other person here, was a co-author of the book North to Aztlan, which was a textbook. And he's a tremendous scholar. I mean, he's much more productive in terms of writing, and he lives in San Angelo, Texas, which is a West Texas oil town filled with rednecks. But he's managed to survive, as many Tejanos have, by being very respectable, very productive, very hardworking. And so anyway, he has been inspiring to me in terms of writing that book, motivating me to develop my topics and do research. Richard Garcia, another influence, was another co-author on the Cesar Chavez book. And Cesar Chavez, I got involved with that because, well, first of all, the publisher asked if I could write a book on Cesar Chavez. They were doing a series on great Americans, right? And Cesar Chavez was the first Spanish surnamed American that they were going to do a book on. This is University of Oklahoma Press. So this was really important, I thought. This was important to have a book in this Great American series. So I started doing the research, and of course, at that time, and even now today, Cesar Chavez is the one Chicano in the United States who has more things written about him than anybody. I mean, it's a tremendous amount of information. Books, articles, archives, everything. Tremendous amount of stuff. So what can you say new, you know? What can you say that's important that hasn't already been said? So I began reading through all the stuff, everything I could find that had been published by Cesar Chavez, or about Cesar Chavez. And eventually I thought, well, I've got to interview him. He was still alive at that time. So I went and went through a long process. It was not easy to contact Cesar Chavez because he lived up in a little retreat near Tehachapi, near Bakersfield. So managed to have an interview with him, and it was very tense at that time. Cesar Chavez, at this point, it was in 1991, about a year before he died. And everybody had turned on him. He felt his best friends had turned on him. You know, the people that he had trusted most had turned on him, except for maybe Dolores Huerta and other people like that. But so he was not feeling too good about things. So we had a long, long interview for about 3 hours. And I was sort of nervous because he was nervous, I guess. He was not happy about things. So I forgot to get him to sign the release in terms of oral interview. You know, when you do an oral interview, you sign a thing saying, I give permission for you to. So I forgot to get him to do that. So it ended up being just background stuff that I did save the tapes, and I had the tapes transcribed eventually, and they're in the archive at UCLA. So they are available, but they were unauthorized in terms of Cesar Chavez. Of course, he died. Okay, the thing about that book, Cesar Chavez, was there were people who were very touchy about being talked about in this book. His lawyers, a couple of the people who had fallen out with him. And when you try to tell the story of the UFW and Chavez, there are people who you're going to step on some toes. And so I got a couple of nasty phone calls from some of the ex-Chavistas, people who were unhappy about the Union and did not like being mentioned in the book in the way that I was mentioning them. So I decided I better get a co-author. So I asked Richard Garcia, who is a Chicano historian, was a Chicano historian at Cal State Hayward, which doesn't exist anymore, I think. Cal State Hayward is a new name. He had written his dissertation, 2 volumes about that thick, on the Historia de San Antonio, Texas, the Chicano community of San Antonio, Texas. Intellectual history, cultural history. Very, very thorough, complete. So Richard agreed to take this on, and he contributed the chapters dealing with Cesar Chavez as an intellectual force in the Chicano movement. So that book on Cesar Chavez was, to my mind, it's still the only book that has been written about Cesar Chavez by Chicanos in a favorable way. There's 1 or 2 that are real negative, but that integrates Chavez as part of the Chicano movement. So to me, that's an important contribution, a new interpretation, a new take on Chavez. Another person who's been influential in helping and motivating me is now passed on. His name is Richard Steele. He was a professor of history at San Diego State. I guess, Raul, you probably took him. And Olivia, you probably knew him, right? Yeah. He was a liberal East Coast person who loved civil rights, and especially World War II, and the civil rights of minorities during World War II. But he had never studied or knew anything about, he knew nothing about the Mexican-American struggle during World War II, what had happened to them. So he asked me to educate him, so I gave him a list of all the books, and not very many books, in fact, but books and articles that dealt with World War II and Mexican Americans. So he read them all, and then we got together, and he wrote a chapter, I wrote a chapter, back and forth. And it was a study of the civil rights, of the struggle for civil rights by Mexican Americans during World War II, which was a fairly new topic. I mean, and nobody had written a book about it. People had mentioned it, that Mexican Americans had been involved in fighting for civil rights during the Second World War. But how and exactly, who exactly, were not widely known. So Richard Steele and I more or less fleshed out this book, and then unfortunately he had cancer and he died. So I continued with the book, and with the help of his widow, in an agreement with his widow, we had it published. So University of Texas Press, actually it's the only book, World War II, it was called Mexican Americans, Civil Rights, and World War II. And it's the only book that proposal I've ever developed that was accepted by 3 major presses: UNM, or University of New Mexico, University of Arizona, and University of Texas. They were very interested in this topic. It had a kind of national appeal. So we went with University of Texas because it's bigger press, wider distribution, larger audience, more respected perhaps, I don't know. Okay, moving along on influences in why I wrote history or why I've written things. Isidro Ortiz is another colleague of mine up at San Diego State. I'm sure Raul remembers Isidro. Raul taught in our department for many years, and taught Chicano history, in fact. And but Isidro is a very intelligent, hardworking individual who's very connected to the community, very connected to students, to activities in the community, to trying to improve conditions for Mexican and Chicano education in San Diego. He's from Corpus Christi, Texas. Had a rough childhood growing up. Went to Santa Barbara, UC Santa Barbara, and then Stanford. I'm sorry, he taught at Santa Barbara. He went to Stanford, Stanford graduate. Well, Isidro and I had the idea of trying to do a book about San Diego, the Chicano history of San Diego. And again, this was an area that nobody knew anything about. I mean, there's lots of studies about Mexican and Spanish San Diego up to 1848. Iris Engstrand over at USD has a lot of influence there. So anyway, you can find books and all kinds of things about the Spanish missions and the Presidio and in the Mexican ranchos even. But after 1848, all of a sudden, the Mexicanos have disappeared, right? They're invisible. They're no longer a factor in San Diego's history. So we felt it was important to be the voice for Mexicanos in San Diego and say, we're here, this is our history after 1848. So with Isidro's motivation, we did this anthology. He wrote a chapter, I wrote 2 or 3, and a lot of other people, my wife included. I better move right along because I only have a few more minutes and I want to be sure and mention my wife, right, as an influence. Another person that has been influencing my life lately is Enrique Morones, who you may or may not know, the founder of the Border Angels, received the National Award for Human Rights from Mexico. Is from San Diego, but is also a Mexican citizen, has lots of activities and so forth. Anyway, Enrique asked me to write a book about the Border Angels. So I sat down with him, and he talked. That's one, if you know Enrique, you know he loves to talk. So he talked and talked and talked and talked. And I had a tape recorder, and I taped everything he said, and then I went back and I transcribed it and edited it and put it together in a book. So basically, it's the story of the Border Angels as told by Enrique Morones. It's called The Power of One, which refers to a story he tells at the beginning. I'm going to give this copy to Dr. Guillen as for his personal library, but I'm sure your library here will have a copy as well. So this is the last book, basically. And I suppose this anthology, David is also motivating me again to get involved in doing another anthology, this one for Mexicanos, about Chicano history. These will be translated, essays, chapters from books, and so forth that will be an introduction to Chicano history. And of course, students in my classes at various times have been important in motivating me, because I'll be talking about something and it'll be something that I'm writing about, and it'll make me want to investigate more and be clearer about what I was going to be saying. Don't want to leave them out. I'm sure there's many other people that have influenced me at different times, but these are some of the more important people. And now we get to Las Mujeres en Mi Vida, right? Muy importante, as you all know. My first wife, Marianne, is there on the right, in a hat. She was born and raised in East Los Angeles, in Boyle Heights. She was more Chicano than me, right? I mean, her friends were the Roybal sisters. If you know anything about the Roybals, they're a very old political family in East Los Angeles. And Lucille Roybal is a congressman today. Anyway, she went to school with them, and they were friends. And anyway, she knew all about East LA. You know, I'd go over there and visit, and there'd be chickens in the yard next door, roosters crowing, and all kind of salsa music going, and so forth. So it was a new experience for me, an immersion into East Los Angeles. So we met and married. And she encouraged me. She said, you've got to pursue the Chicano history career, not only because I want to be able to eat, but because, it's important to you and it's important to me too. So she encouraged me, but most of all, she gave me freedom to do things. We moved all over the place, doing research. San Antonio, Santa Fe, Mexico City, Washington, D.C., and she was willing to go along and let me do what I had to do, which meant being away from her, really, for long periods of time. So I really owe her a lot in terms of being able to write some of these books. She unfortunately passed away from cancer about almost 20 years ago. And by luck, I actually had known Rita Sanchez, who is on your left. I'm wearing shorts in both of those pictures. I don't know if that means anything, but Rita was born and raised in San Bernardino from a family of 11 children. Her parents were from New Mexico. And again, she taught Chicano literature and history, and English. She graduated from Stanford with a master's degree. And she's one of the first women to teach Chicana history, Chicano studies, Chicana studies, women's studies, at San Diego State in '74 and Mesa College and so forth. And she's been very active, much more active than I, and still remains so in the Chicana movement, and much more active doing research, I have to say. I mean, she is, besides her research on Chicanas, she is now doing genealogy. Is anybody a genealogist here? Anybody ever do genealogy? It's a disease. Because it takes over your life. It's so complicated. It's so complicated and deep. And so she works on it night and day. Right now she's working on genealogy. Right now as I'm speaking, she's doing genealogical research. She's published in that area. So she has encouraged me, mostly by telling me to do things, to research and to be careful in what I'm doing and so forth and so on. Kept me involved. So she's been an important influence. So I have 3 kids, 2 kids. She had 4 kids, and we have now 9 grandkids, 1 great-grandkid. So that keeps us busy. I just want to skip quickly to the end of my talk. I know I'm a little bit over. I'll go through the books. This is what they look like, the covers. Well, the North Tuaztlan book, I forgot to mention, was translated into Spanish by the UNAM, CISEOA. Now it's some other acronym, but the UNAM had an institute for the study of the United States and Canada, and they translated the first 5 chapters of North Tuaztlan into Spanish. Chicano San Diego, World War II, Mexican-American Civil Rights, and the Power of One book. And what have I been doing since retirement? 5 years ago, I stopped teaching. This is one of the projects, the Chicano Archive Project, which is to gather the photographs, papers, and so forth of Chicano activists, meaning people my age now, who were active in the 50s, 60s and 70s, and to put them into an archive at San Diego State so that the next generation will have some record of what we have been up to, what we were doing. See, there's some of the people that are in the archive and the kinds of materials we had. Most recently, Gracia Molina de Pic, who you may or may not know of. She was actually one of the leaders in the Mexican suffrage movement for women to get the vote. She came to the U.S. in '53, '54, and is very active in women's issues. She donated 50 boxes of her material to the Chicano Archive, which is a real wonderful record of the struggle of women in San Diego, Chicana women, Mexican women, and she's been really important for it. Okay, well, I think I better stop. Yeah. Thank you for your attention.
Pues, antes de que pasemos a un diálogo, no sé si la doctora Olivia Ruiz quisiera decir unas palabras y luego podemos, todavía nos queda un poquito de tiempo para dialogar con el doctor Griswold, que como ustedes ven, pues tiene una temática increíblemente variada, como había mencionado, y rica, que quizás quisieran preguntarle no nomás de esto, sino es una de las figuras capitales en el estudio de la historia chicana.
Bueno, yo no quisiera tomar demasiado tiempo, pero muchísimas gracias, Richard, por tu presentación. Sí, aquí estoy, cambié de lugar. Muchísimas gracias, y creo que en algún momento te tenemos que entrevistar a ti y hacerte preguntas sobre la historia chicana, además porque viviste ese desarrollo de todo lo que es el desarrollo de los estudios Chicano Studies en Estados Unidos, en el suroeste, que es una época muy importante obviamente para la comprensión de lo que es la población mexicana en Estados Unidos, y además para el desarrollo de la conciencia política e intelectual dentro de las universidades y fuera de las universidades. Entonces, creo que en algún momento tenemos que hacer algo contigo. Me parece muy interesante como lo que es el perfil de tu historia, y además pensando también como México-americana, chicana, lo que sea, la población mexicana de Estados Unidos, la diversidad de experiencias. O sea, no podemos hablar de una población mexicana de Estados Unidos, es una población muy diversa, con muchas experiencias. Creo que lo que tú planteas además es muy interesante en términos de esa generación, por ejemplo, de tu mamá, y la presión para asimilarse. Y en tu caso hubo algo muy interesante que se me hace singular, además, que fue una relación interethnic y interracial, ¿no? Que en aquella época los mexicanos en muchos sentidos no se casaban con anglos o fuera de la población mexicana. Entonces es una experiencia especial. O sea, en ese sentido tú viviste algo que es un poco la vanguardia, porque en las generaciones ya que siguieron, sí hubo más, ya empezamos a ver más matrimonios mixtos, ¿no? Pero en tu caso, fuiste, en ese sentido, imagino que ha de haber sido un poco, ¿qué podríamos decir? Un singular y un poco aislado, ¿no? Y me llama la atención que fuiste a Francia. O sea, dijiste, ya dejo todo y me voy a un lugar totalmente diferente, ¿no? El hecho de que tus papás, la familia de tu mamá haya salido de México durante la Revolución, creo que es una experiencia también, un lazo común. Lo comparto en mi familia, lo compartimos muchas familias. Llegar a Estados Unidos de esa forma. Y hay cosas que yo quisiera saber, entonces voy a terminar con eso. Uno, me llamó la atención los lazos afectivos con los abuelos. Your grandparents, the importance of your grandparents. Entonces eso es muy interesante, que los lazos afectivos además, y no con los abuelos de tu padre. No sé si es porque no estaban en Los Ángeles o simplemente que no se dio ese cariño, esa intimidad, lo que sea, con esos abuelos. Y además que la mamá, pues siempre la relación con la mamá y la familia de la mamá siempre como que pesa, ¿no? En esos casos. El trabajo manual, o sea, es una experiencia, creo que de la población mexicana en Estados Unidos, ¿no? Además de trabajo manual a trabajo intelectual, que es y esa es una experiencia muy angloamericana, digo, de los Estados Unidos. Esos arcos no se dan fácilmente en otras partes, por ejemplo en México. Es alguien que está así como una pala y sacando, sí. En fin. Y las decisiones en el grupo chicano, o sea, también que entre los chicanos, el grupo chicano, también hay fragmentos, hay grupos, a veces hay diferencias de visión, y el caso de César Chávez es emblemático de esas divisiones que existen en la población, incluso la población que en un momento dado se reunió alrededor de una causa como fue la causa de los farm workers, ¿no? Uh-huh. En fin, yo quisiera dejarlo aquí para que el resto de los asistentes pudieran hacerte preguntas. Pero muchísimas gracias, y creo que hay muchas más preguntas en tu biografía. Gracias.
Gracias, Olivia.
Pues, yo quisiera comenzar con una pregunta que creo que una cosa importantísima de mencionar, que no lo hice en mi presentación, es que la generación del profesor Griswold del Castillo fue la primera que originó los estudios chicanos. Como él decía, mis maestros nos enseñaban un poquito de aquí y un poquito de allá, pero ellos fueron los primeros que organizaron cursos, departamentos, facultades y centros de investigación. Entonces, como tal, como desde esa época hasta ahora, pues ha visto toda la disciplina crecer, subas y bajas, que entonces yo quisiera comenzar con esta pregunta. ¿Cómo harías un balance de esta evolución desde la fundación hasta hoy? Brevemente.
¿Balancear?
Un balance, no, un assessment.
Oh. Bueno, hay mucho más de leer hoy sobre estudios chicanos en general y historia chicana también. Mucho más información, mucho más archivos como aquí de consultar, mucho más apoyo para los jóvenes que quieren estudiar la historia chicana. Y más competencia, more competition, mucho más difícil de conseguir un lugar, un tenure track position, a job to teach, so es mucho más difícil hoy. En mi juventud, you know, fue fácil, mucho más fácil de conseguir un trabajo. Bueno, hay más diversidad en la población, pero diversidad en temas y theoretical positions. El movimiento Chicana es muy importante, the theoretical critique of Chicano history from the Chicana point of view is very, very influential and important. So all these things developed over time.
Muy bien, los invito a platicar, a dialogar con el profesor. ¿Sí?
Muy breve, Ricardo. No es mi área, pero siento que hay cierta presión a nivel nacional en algunos países, no solo en Estados Unidos, pero en Estados Unidos. Supe que querían cambiar algunos, en lugar de estudios chicanos, poner estudios técnicos o algo así. Porque los estudios chicanos no estamos acabando con la nación o provocando divisiones entre los grupos. Y entre los historiadores también de no estudiar de los grupos, más bien algo que nos hace entender algo, comprender algo como la nación, una cultura nacional o algo más allá. Entonces hay cosa que hoy en día nos hace un poco, bueno, para nosotros que, bueno, ustedes no, que en los 60 crecieron con Black Studies, Chicano Studies, Asian Studies. Y ahora hay esa tendencia, pero no, tenemos que acabar con estos. Entonces, pero una cosa que mencionaste, y lo voy a ser muy breve, el movimiento de derechos civiles nos puede. Eso es importante saber, conocer. Y sin esos estudios, gracias a eso, sí, estamos mucho más conscientes. No empieza con Martin Luther King o antes de los 50, sin embargo, es mucho más amplio y ayuda a saber y conocer más. Entonces, entre los grupos que quieren saber más sobre la historia de Estados Unidos, sí, deberían estar interesados en ese tipo de cosas, Black Studies, aun cuando no pertenecen al grupo, entre comillas. Pueden ser de otros orígenes, pero deberían tener ese interés o deseo de saber y conocer más. Pero agrupar a todo y reducirlo al Departamento de Estudios Técnicos, aplicarlo racial, en algunos, sí hay esas tendencias también entre los funcionarios y las universidades y los gobiernos de hacer este tipo de cosas, pero ¿qué opinas de eso?
Bueno, tienes razón, en el pasado tuvieron movimiento para consolidar esos departamentos de estudios étnicos en un departamento, pero eso pasó. Ahora hay más y más departamentos de estudios chicanos, de chicanos. Rudy Acuña, que es sort of the encyclopedist of Chicano studies, Chicano history, did a book on the department, what's the name for it? Anyway, the study of Chicano studies, basically, is his department. But at the back of his book, he has an appendix that lists all the Chicano studies departments in the country, and Latino studies, and Hispanic studies, things like that. There's hundreds of them. I mean, it hasn't diminished. It's grown. So there's no, I don't think that that's a movement to collapse necessarily. In some places perhaps, but nationally, no. I think there's more and more appreciation de la importancia de la experiencia de los mexicanos en los Estados Unidos, más y más, porque está creciendo la población, estamos acercando las elecciones nacionales, and the Democrats and Republicans are struggling with each other, and so they're not about to alienate more alienate the Mexicanos in that way. So yeah, so I think there's a growing acceptance for, it's been, like almost 70, since 1970 más o menos, it's almost 40 years. Chicano studies have been in existence for almost 40 years. Aslan, which is the major journal, and you can get it online. By the way, I passed out recursos para estudiar la historia chicana in the internet, because I know many people don't read books anymore. So you can go to the internet, and this first one, La Historia Chicana de San Diego, that's almost the entire book that David was showing you of Chicano San Diego. So you can, for nothing, free, read and look and research the Chicano history of San Diego. The book, at least, on here. And Chicano Park, the same thing. Chicano Archive, this one here, you can access it. It's a web page that enables you to see what resources there are. La Guerra con los Estados Unidos de Mexico. I've been very fortunate because of the books to be involved with film projects, documentary films. And one of the biggest was this U.S.-Mexican War documentary. Note they had never made, the United States had not yet made a documentary film about La Guerra con Mexico, about the U.S.-Mexican War. So Paul Espinosa and others got a grant, and they made a film, a 2-hour documentary sobre La Guerra con Mexico. Very detailed, very beautifully done, lots of information. And this website here will show you some clips from the film and other things. Then, of course, YouTube. As you know, you can access so many things on YouTube. You can get clips of all kinds of video materials. And if you want to know more or see films and videos about Joaquin, well, first of all, I Am Joaquin, the film I Am Joaquin, was the first Chicano film made by a Chicano, for Chicanos, about Chicanos. Okay? I Am Joaquin. And that's available in the whole thing, free on YouTube. Cesar Chavez, of course, lots of stuff on him, Reyes Tijerina, and so forth. So that's a resource for you.
Sí.
Muchas gracias por su presentación y por compartir también su propia trayectoria. Y quisiera preguntar en relación a esa identificación como chicanos, que históricamente tal vez también ha ido cambiando quiénes se identifican como chicanos, quiénes se adscriben como chicanos. Ver si en este desarrollo histórico de una identidad chicana, ¿en qué momento se da esta convergencia o esta identificación ya no solo de los de ascendencia mexicana, sino también centroamericana como chicanos, que es un poco lo que yo también he visto, sobre todo en los formas de identificarse como chicano, también empieza a haber como ciertas formas de solidaridad entre diversos grupos minoritarios étnicos que se adscriben en función de esta conciencia política, ¿no?, de discriminación de la nación de Estados Unidos. Entonces, quisiera saber si en el desarrollo histórico de los chicanos hay un momento específico en el que se empieza a dar como esta característica.
Bueno, desde el principio del movimiento chicano había, bueno, una conciencia de, bueno, la historia de Latinoamérica, la historia de Cuba, y, bueno, los problemas de Centroamérica, the Iran-Contra situation and the beginning of large-scale migration from Central America. Los chicanos eran parte de este, bueno, movimiento para criticar el gobierno de los Estados Unidos for their policies and what they had done to, provoke civil war in Central America. So, in terms of identity, yeah, it's always been complicated. I don't think, in terms of Chicano identification, that's something that still is only a minority of people really consciously talk about. And usually it's as a result of education, although in the barrio, in Logan Heights, for example, it's common. Chicano is very common as a term. But yeah, it's changing. Everything changes. Nothing stays the same. The term Chicano is still around, and it has been, the first use of the term Chicano was in Laredo, Texas in 1909, at least the first recorded use. And it referred to a Mexicano immigrant crossing. Eran los Chicanos. Read Ernesto Galarza's book, Barrio Boy. He talks about the Chicanos, and what he means by Chicanos are Mexican immigrants. That was the term. So the Chicano movement was to take that distinction away and say we're all Chicanos, immigrants, native-born, U.S. citizens, non-citizens, undocumented, everybody. So it's a consciousness, really. It's not a racial. It's a consciousness that not primarily racial. I don't know if I've answered your question. ¿Algo más? Sí.
Hola, buenas tardes. Primero que nada, muchas felicidades por su excelente exposición. Y cuando usted comenzó a describir cómo llegó la familia de su mamá a Estados Unidos, inmediatamente recordé el filme de Gregory Nava de 1994, Mi familia, My Family. Es una película que retrata esta época posrevolucionaria y de la familia que llega a Estados Unidos, que es un caso muy reconocido, muy amplio, y me puse a pensar que gran parte de la sociedad mexicana lo que conoce o lo que también reconoce como chicano es a través de la industria cinematográfica, ¿verdad? Entonces, por ejemplo, en la década de los 90, una ebullición de filmes que trataban el caso de los chicanos, ¿verdad? Y muy relacionada también con distintas tribus urbanas, por ejemplo, en la franja fronteriza, como los cholos, etcétera. Usted, como chicano, ¿cómo observa o cómo ha observado a lo largo de su vida el tratamiento que se ha hecho sobre los chicanos a través de la industria cinematográfica? No sé si me pudiera responder eso.
Bueno, esa pregunta mejor mi colega David, que ha escrito muchos libros sobre ese asunto. En general, todavía existe explotación, ¿no?, de los chicanos, Lola la trailera y todo.
Creo que también hay algo de que, por ejemplo, en Hollywood, hablando con actores, por ejemplo, de ascendencia mexicana, o latinos en Estados Unidos, todavía hay muy poco trabajo y salen como ¿cómo me dijo el otro día? Gangs, thugs, and no sé qué. O sea, es muy difícil conseguir trabajo para. Entonces, eso significa que se proyectan imágenes que todavía son muy estereotipadas, ¿no?
Buenas tardes. Mi nombre es Nancy, soy técnico académico del Departamento de Estudios Culturales. Profesor Richard, me da mucho gusto que está acá presentando su trayectoria. Sabe que tuve la gran fortuna de tomar una clase con usted y me transformó totalmente la perspectiva de la historia chicana. Estoy muy emocionada que esté aquí. Mi pregunta va en torno a, usted estudia familia, entonces su libro sobre la familia chicana pues fue para mí una pauta para hacer estudios sobre la familia transfronteriza. Con las nuevas políticas migratorias, ¿cómo se ha transformado la consciousness que menciona de la familia chicana, ahora con deportaciones y que la familia ya está dividida? Ya hay más familias separadas y que las posibilidades de que se vuelvan a reunir son pocas. Muchas familias se regresan totalmente, todas a México, y otras deciden quedarse separadas. Quisiera saber su punto de vista acerca de estas transformaciones familiares de la familia chicana y si acaso se está formando un nuevo consciousness chicano, uno en México y otro en Estados Unidos.
Sí. Bueno, Nancy fue estudiante en San Diego State de nuestro programa de estudios chicanos, ¿no? Y realmente no sé cómo está hoy, bueno, porque he estudiado la historia de la familia en el siglo pasado, ¿no? Pero en general el miedo es el peor realidad que resulta de este 9/11, the 9/11 incident. El miedo de los que cruzan la frontera hay más crímenes de odio contra los migrantes en los Estados Unidos hoy que antes. Miedo de la migra de ICE, deportación y todo. Cuentos muy tristes de familias separadas, niños separados de sus madres y todo. Tú sabes, todo el mundo sabe de eso, pero ¿qué podemos hacer? Estamos tratando en varios grupos, Enrique también, de cambiar la ley, de cambiar el gobierno para dar más. Bueno, necesitamos realmente nuevas leyes de inmigración para cambiar el ambiente de la familia. No sé si es una respuesta para tu pregunta o no.
Bueno, perdón, básicamente quería saber cómo lo percibía usted, pero ya sí me queda claro.
¿Cómo qué?
Sí, si estaba cambiando como el consciousness de que hablaba de ser chicano, de la identidad de las familias, de las identidades de las familias chicanas. Si realmente, cuando ya está una mitad se queda en Estados Unidos y la otra mitad se queda en México,
sí.
y se lo digo proyectando desde mi propia experiencia. Si me preguntan si yo soy chicana, yo diría, no, yo no sé si soy chicana o soy mexicana, nada más sé que tengo papá estadounidense y mamá mexicana, pero sí, como vivo en México y estoy en mi territorio, pues soy mexicana.
Sí,
¿no?
sí.
Entonces, esos chicanos que están en Estados Unidos, que ahora se tienen que regresar para tener la familia unida, si siguen teniendo este consciousness de familia chicana.
Sí, ok, muy bien. Sí, me cambió mi nombre de Griswold a Griswold del Castillo en 72, creo, bueno, porque mi madre, la familia de mi madre, los del Castillo, eran todas mujeres, ¿no? Van a perder su nombre en los Estados Unidos y por eso, pero también para darme más credibilidad al principio. Bueno, antes de abrir mi boca, to give myself more credibility in doing what I was doing, which was teaching and doing research. So in terms of family feelings, whether you're Mexican or Chicano and so forth, that matters at certain levels in different environments. In other environments, it doesn't matter. In the United States, if you're a Mexicano, you look brown, you live in the barrio, and the ICE come, they're not going to care whether you say, hey, I'm a citizen, you know. How do you prove it? You don't have a passport. So there's lots of instances of violation of rights of Chicanos even though they're U.S. citizens, because they're mistaken, or let's say the ICE, they don't see a differentiation between the two. So your identity, what you call yourself, really doesn't make any difference to the ICE people.
Pues una última pregunta.
Bueno, yo,
Sí.
pues me sorprende, doctor, porque no solamente puede hablarnos de los personajes esenciales de la historia chicana, como César Chávez, por ejemplo, sino también puede mencionarnos cabalmente la labor de todos los historiadores de la historia chicana. Y desde la historia se me hace sorprendente que un sujeto pueda historizar su propio periodo vital, su vida, pues, de manera casi autobiográfica. Y la pregunta es la siguiente, doctor. Si el surgimiento del movimiento chicano intelectual y culturalmente tiene cierto rechazo hacia lo estadounidense o cierta defensa, ¿cuáles son sus influencias desde el punto de vista historiográfico? Es decir, ¿de dónde se nutre? Porque por un lado veo que desarrolla la historia de la familia, y me recuerda aquel título del siglo XIX, Historia de la familia, la propiedad privada y el Estado, que es un título del marxismo. Pero por otro lado veo indicios, o no indicios, no, que desarrolla la historia cultural. Me viene a la cabeza la historia cultural francesa. No sé si aunque sea un movimiento que se defiende contra lo angloamericano en cierto aspecto, retoma también raíces del intelecto angloamericano, o se basa en lo desarrollado en Europa, o está desarrollando objetos nuevos de investigación.
Ok, gracias. Las influencias intelectuales, historiográficas, para mis primeros dos libros, La Familia y The Los Angeles Barrio, came from something called the New Social History. Este fue un movimiento de historiadores americanos para estudiar el hombre común, the common man, fuera de those who left written records and so forth were very few, in the old days. And how many letters? Not very few. So you look at the statistics. It's a statistical history. So I was influenced by that movement to look at history from the bottom up, from the people at the bottom going up rather than down. So that was one influence. As far as theories and so forth, I suppose the internal colonial theory of Mario Barrera was important, has been important in my teaching, certainly. And I think the models of writing, persons that I have admired who have written history, have been, of all things, W.W. Robinson, who has written many little small books about Los Angeles history, but also, as I mentioned, my friend who helped me edit at the beginning, taught me about the importance of writing. So those are influences as well. But in terms of theoretical direction, I gave a try. I tried in several essays to get my feet into postmodern theory. discourse theory and so forth, and to look at the ways in which that theory might be useful in interpreting, for example, the narratives that Mexicanas left after the U.S.-Mexican War. And that was fun, that was interesting, but it was something I didn't really pursue too much more. I'm aware that there's lots of critical theory that could be brought to it, mostly in literature, very little in history really is practically used. But so thank you for your question. Gracias.
Pues muchas gracias a ustedes y otra vez muchas gracias al profesor Griswold de habernos honrado con su presencia. Como ven, pues esto pudiera seguir por días, porque los temas que abarca y los temas que están por delante son muchísimos. Pues gracias nuevamente y le damos un aplauso de